Look, you can keep your CSI Miamis and your Miami Vices because the only crime I care about is the kind being committed by giant robots. I'm talking about Mobile Police Patlabor, a franchise from back in the 80s in which the Japanese government thought it would be a good idea to give Mecha to their police force. See, in the distant future of the 1990s, global warming has caused the sea levels around Japan to rise. To combat this, the Japanese government launched a huge campaign to reclaim land called the Babylon Project. Due to this sudden demand, construction technology accelerated quickly, resulting in a boom of giant mechs known as laborers. With thousands of these things being used around the country came a rise in labor-related crimes. Whether it be drunks using their labor from work to stomp up the place, or terrorist attacks by paramilitary forces and disgruntled environmentalists, the only thing able to stop a giant robot is another giant robot. Luckily, the police force's second special vehicles section is there to protect the public using their own labors to deal out justice in a skillful and tasteful manner. Wait, no, actually that's their first division. But this series focuses on Division 2, a lovable group of misfits who cause collateral damage more often than stopping crimes, despite their best intentions. The concept of the series was conceived by a group of creators who came together under the name Headgear. This included members such as the manga artist Masami Yuki, who created Birdie the Mighty, as well as director Mamoru Oshii, who's well known for his work on Ghost in the Shell, among many other things. From the start, Patlabor was intended to be a multimedia franchise, starting with a manga with an OVA based on the same concept releasing just a month later. From there, it received theatrical films, a television series, another OVA for good measure, alongside video games, novels, and even a live-action adaptation. The series focuses primarily on Division 2's main pilot, Noa Izumi, who pilots an AV-98 Ingram that she's nicknamed Alphonse. The Ingram's a state-of-the-art labor that can pack a stun baton and a 37mm revolver, among other things. With it, Noa and the rest of her team are tasked with putting a stop to any labor-related wrongdoings around Japan, with force if necessary. Basically, imagine if RoboCop was actually a giant robot cop. But really, fighting giant robots is actually a pretty small part of what the team does, and when they aren't doing manual labor during their downtime, they're getting roped into jobs that are only tangentially related to their mission. The series does a great job finding unique scenarios for them to take on, and a lot of the time they're unique simply because these are giant robots running around performing these tasks. Rescuing people from a burning building would be pretty interesting even if it was just normal people doing it, but turn it into an episode where only Division 2's Ingrams can get the job done, and it becomes something new, with all of the extra considerations that need to be taken into account to accommodate these huge machines. A lot of these episodes are on what would normally be considered pretty mundane topics, like helping a whale get back out to sea, or dealing with an insurance claim. Many episodes aren't even about mecha action at all. There's an entire episode dedicated to the team just trying to get lunch, which was absolutely hilarious. Noa goes around getting everyone's orders, and we get to meet all of these no-name mechanics that have never been given any screen time before. Then she forgets what everyone wanted right as she begins to order, meaning she has to go around asking everyone again, but getting berated as they get more and more hungry. Noa herself is quite the main character. Her characterization changes a bit depending on what entry you're watching, but regardless, she has this innocence to her and such an unrelenting good nature that you always empathize with her when she gets knocked down. And that's a common occurrence, but watching her accept her missteps, learn from them, and bounce back to meet what's required of her will have you grow to respect her. She has a great deal of sense and humility to her despite her outwardly naive demeanor. Though that bubble-headed nature is exactly what makes her so entertaining to watch when she's introduced to new situations. But she's only one piece of the puzzle, because really, the supporting cast is just as important as she is. Sometimes she's only a small element of the story, with the spotlight almost entirely focused on another character. We might see the team's seemingly lackadaisical Captain Goto go underground and risk his career to stop a conspiracy. Or we might see the snarky Asuma get too invested in a situation due to how it connects to his father's labor manufacturing company. Everyone gets their moment to shine and contribute in their own way to the success of a mission. There are just so many interesting dynamics between the characters going on at all times. Like the way the two division captains have a rivalry between each other, but at the same time are always looking out for one another. Or even how Division 2's other Ingram pilot, the hot-headed brute Ota, can only be tamed by the extremely intelligent and equally beautiful Kanuka Clancy. She's a temporary member of the team sent over from the States to observe how they operate so the NYPD can set up their own labor division. And because of that, she's extremely proficient at piloting labors, handling firearms, and can even speak both Japanese and English. One of the funniest episodes is one where the second-in-command mechanic, Shigi, gets sent to visit Clancy back in New York, and the entire episode is this insane exaggeration of what America is like, blended with parodies of other sci-fi franchises. This isn't even the only episode like this, and seeing Patlabor's take on Ultraman and Gundam is really funny. The whole series is incredibly charming with a great sense of humor, and it still manages to balance that against a grounded and dignified setting and tone. It always portrays its world with a great degree of detail and legitimacy, and the same can be said about its characters and Mecha. First and foremost, this is a series about its human characters and world, and the futuristic technology that actually only makes up a small portion of the setting is an extension and tool for those characters to accomplish their missions. Well, unless you're Noah, who treats Alphonse better than a real person and freaks out when some dirt gets on him. Half the time she's avoiding fighting not because she thinks she'll lose, but because she doesn't want Alphonse to get dented when she lays the smackdown. That's a legitimate concern, because despite how absurd the concept of the police using a giant robot to fight crime is, it's all handled in a pretty grounded and realistic way, with robots breaking apart and falling all over the place, like they probably would in real life. This isn't a series where a character will power up and achieve crazy feats. Getting worked up usually ends up getting people in more trouble, which is basically all Ota ever accomplishes. Trying to break free of an enemy's hold usually results in their own arms being ripped off, and damage like that is very serious, because their limbs are really all they have to do their job, and without them, they're basically helpless. These robots don't have ass-pulley regeneration powers or some kind of signature finishing move that they can trigger when they're about to lose. It's just strategy and skill that determines who comes out on top when these giant machines do battle. Even the way the Ingrams are operated in the cockpit is fleshed out. They go into a good amount of detail on the weapons available to the pilots and the onboard sensors and systems that make it up. Each pilot has a disc that carries their personal movement data, which allows their Ingram to refine itself to their unique quirks. The more you use the machine, the more it becomes an extension of you, as long as you have your disc. The hand cannon the Ingram uses is so large it leaves a crater anytime it's dropped, and there's a lot more to operating and navigating in these things than the typical robot action anime. Their division isn't just made up of pilots, they're accompanied by transport vehicle operators as well as teammates that follow them around in these small cars to provide situational awareness and give instructions to the person operating the robot. Without all of these characters doing their jobs, things wouldn't turn out so well, and we get to see that as various restrictions and challenges are imposed on the characters throughout the episodes. Really, the human drama in this series hits just as hard as the robot fighting itself, and probably ends up making up more of its runtime, especially in the movies. The series has a real sense of maturity to it, in that it handles itself with a sense of perspective and tact that isn't exactly present in most shows. It knows how to have fun like I mentioned before, but it also knows when to be quiet, subtle with its dialogue choices, and when to allow for some introspection on the part of the viewer. It lets you breathe in the atmosphere and relate things back to your own life. It's a series about normal people living their normal lives, doing their jobs and having some banter along the way. Personally, being in the Air Force and getting stationed at a small base in Korea definitely has me relating to the lifestyle these characters live in the show. All the saluting, the sense of camaraderie, and the improvisation that they have to do is definitely familiar to me. Interestingly, despite being so grounded, there are some pretty out there episodes about things like sea monsters and ghosts. The supernatural doesn't make up a large portion of the series at all, so the episodes that feature this stuff end up feeling out of left field every time they pop up. They're handled well, but still, this doesn't really feel like a setting where this kind of stuff would exist. Though it depends on which incarnation of Patlabor you're watching, because there can be a huge tonal difference between entries to the point where it's hard to believe they're set in the same universe. Your mileage may vary on how much you think those episodes are consistent with the rest of the franchise. What is consistent is how good Patlabor's art design always is. The series perfectly encapsulates that incredibly appealing 80s anime aesthetic. The actual art style varies depending on the series, and it's interesting to see these characters brought to life in slightly different ways. As a whole, it just radiates personality, from the way its characters act to the bright colors used to bring it all to life. And this is all tied together with great music as well. Almost all of it was done by Kenji Kawai, and I don't think this world would have nearly as much personality if it wasn't for his soundtracks. But enough overview, let's get more specific and look at each major entry so you know what each one is all about and how they connect to one another. The first OVA was released in 1988, right after the manga, and it serves almost like a proof of concept of what Patlabor was meant to be like. It differs from the setup of the manga and shows an alternate account of how Division 2 was formed, with all of them showing up at once for their first day of work. It's only 7 episodes, but in that short time frame we go from comedy and action-oriented episodes to supernatural horror, a murder mystery, and we even get a 2-part political thriller. It was pretty successful, and one of the reasons why was its price point, with each episode priced at nearly half of what an OVA normally was. That's why the series appears to have a modest budget, with some great animation showcases at times, but isn't gonna blow your mind like some other high power level OVAs. Originally, it only ran for 6 episodes, but it was so successful that it got a 7th episode, which is my personal favorite. Basically, everything that's good about Patlabor is here, from the hilarious character interactions to the exciting action. But it's hard to really quantify my feelings on this one since it's so much like a sampler of Patlabor concepts. And before you can really sink your teeth into things and get invested in the characters, it's over. But that doesn't mean each episode isn't still entertaining on its own, so of course this gets my recommendation. It's a neat little humble beginnings type thing that'll give you a crash course on what the series and characters are all about. Since it's so short, you can watch it all in an afternoon, so why not? There's definitely some great stuff here that isn't in any of the franchise's other entries. Thanks to the success of the OVA, only a year later in 1989, the series got its first theatrical release with Mobile Police Patlabor the Movie, and this film is absolutely amazing. It tells a self-contained story revolving around laborers working on the Babylon Project going berserk and destroying parts of the city against their operator's will. The whole thing could spell the destruction of Tokyo if Division 2 isn't able to figure out what's going on and how to stop it before the phenomenon gets worse. It's a race against time to solve the twisted puzzle left behind by a hacker who might already be dead. And thanks to this premise, we get a ton of wonderfully animated action sequences in a beautifully realized world. All of the characters look so great and feel perfectly translated from the OVA to the big screen. We also get to see the intricacies of the City and Babylon project in more detail than ever before. There are plenty of scenes without any dialogue dedicated solely to world building. And we get to see the forgotten side of the city whose history is being torn down to make room for the Babylon project's vision of the 21st century. The locations are so rich with detail, and I love any older anime that puts this much effort into rendering computer technology of this era. Overall, this movie is everything great about Patlabor, but given a bigger budget and longer runtime, allowing it to fully realize its setting and tackle a storyline with a much bigger scale. Out of the 3 movies, this one best balances the fun and serious sides of the franchise, and it feels like Patlabor in its purest form. After the success of the film, they waited no time creating a Patlabor series for television. And only 3 months later, again in 1989, the aptly titled Patlabor on Television was released. It's kinda a goofy title, but yeah, I guess it was the first Patlabor entry made for television. This is basically a reboot of the series, starting from the beginning again before Noah is even a member of Division 2. Unlike the OVA, everyone else already is, so a lot of the early episodes are about them showing her the ropes. This setup is more like the manga, but not quite, so if you're keeping track, this is the 3rd Patlabor timeline so far. The original manga, then the OVA and movies which connect, and last is the television timeline. Thanks to this clean slate and 47 episode runtime, the show gets to spend a lot more time world building and fleshing out members of the supporting cast. Even the Division 1 pilots get developed when they were faceless before. They establish so many extra details about the world, from subtle insights into the daily lives of the characters, to bigger picture things like rival labor manufacturers, and the type of labors that come from other countries. This allows for plenty of robot action against new labors with unique designs and abilities. But there's a bit of everything here. Since most episodes are standalone, they can try out tons of different premises, with one episode differing completely from the next. An episode might not even involve labors or crime at all, but will still be entertaining based off the character interactions and situations alone. At the same time, having so many more episodes lets the show have overarching plot threads with antagonists who come in and out of the story. This is the highly advanced, experimental labor Griffin, who's tasked with defeating Division 2's Ingram to prove its superiority. Together with its pilot, they form the ongoing rival of the series, and seeing the characters clash is always exciting. This aspect of the story is borrowed from the manga, and other elements are borrowed from the other entries in the franchise too. So this is kinda like the melting pot of Patlabor concepts, where they take everything they've learned in the past and put it together into one solid product. For example, I noticed they added a black spot to the top of Ota's Ingram so that you wouldn't get the two of them mixed up. Division 1's Captain Nagumo also goes from having black hair to brown, but only in the TV series timeline. I guess so they could have a girl of every hair color? The quality of animation does take a hit due to being a television anime, but I think it makes up for it with an appealing and consistent art style. It feels like they were doing the best they could with the constraints they had, and pivotal scenes always get the extra attention they deserve. If you like the premise of Patlabor and its characters, this is where you're gonna get the most of that. I don't think any single episode is gonna blow your mind like one of the movies, but as a whole, it's still a fantastic watch. It's lower impact episode to episode, but it's a longer burn, and there are bound to be some episodes you end up loving because of how different each one is. At times it feels very slice of life, and it definitely has a lot of heart and humor. Well, if you didn't get your fix off this show, the good news is there's actually a second OVA series that continues where the TV series left off. This began getting released only 2 months after the end of the TV series in 1990, and it'll provide you with another 16 episodes of what you're used to, but with slightly higher production values. Just like the first OVA, this isn't mind-blowing OVA quality, but it does take the art style of the TV series and refine it. The quality of animation is notably higher here, and I really like how crisp and well-defined all of the characters look. Over the course of these episodes, they wrap up the Griffin arc, and the rest is a collection of standalone stories. There isn't that much to say about this OVA as its own thing, but it gives you more of what you wanted if you enjoyed the TV series. These are some quality episodes, so don't forget they exist. Plus, they managed to cram 4 fantastic openings in this thing. This is also the final Patlabor entry like this, so enjoy it while you can. And by that I mean this is the last time you're gonna get this specific setup of characters with this style and tone. After the second OVA ended, they followed it up with a second theatrical movie in 1993. This is a sequel to the first movie set in the same timeline as that and the original OVA. You can tell by the black hair again. What's different about this movie is how somber and realistic it is compared to the previous entries. It's set several years after the first movie, and since then, everyone's been shifted around to new jobs. Everything kicks off when suddenly a major bridge is struck by the missile of an F-16 flying overhead. No one knows why this happened or who did it, and as things continue like this, the country eventually devolves into a bubble just waiting to be popped. We focus primarily on Captain Goto and Nagumo as they're pulled in to untangle this web of conspiracies that reaches all the way to the Japanese government. I don't want to give too much away because figuring things out is part of the enjoyment, but suffice to say, the sense of tension in the film is palpable and the stakes are very high. The film is full of political intrigue and philosophy, with a large focus placed on the precarious position between an unjust peace and a justified war that Japan currently exists in. Dialogue between characters makes up a lot of the film, but they always keep things interesting with surreal, almost dreamlike visuals and short but intense segments of action. The attention to detail given to rendering the machines and equipment in this film is insane, and it's also incredibly accurate in how everything operates too. One of the most tense scenes in the film involves an aircraft intercept from the perspective of 2 guys following the tracks from the ground, and I'm like sweating by the end of this part. Let's just say the amount of time this film puts into studying aircraft wing forms and using technically accurate call signs and brevity terms hits way too close to home. Being set years in the future really changes the dynamic of the world. After the Babylon project's completion, all the laborers that worked on it are beginning to spread throughout Japan to work on various different development projects. This has spread labor crime to areas outside the capital region, and in turn has resulted in the police setting up additional labor forces throughout the country. From a writing perspective, it was really smart to use the Babylon project as the catalyst to justify a rapidly advancing Japan, where labor technology is likely to advance even further as well. Unlike the bright and colorful worlds we've seen before, Patlabor 2's setting is cold and dead with muted colors. We've seen these characters have so much fun together, so it's sad to see them exist in this melancholic world where they've grown older and further apart. Even the Ingram itself is a fossil that's been replaced on the field, and is instead being used to collect test data. Noah is a very different character in this film. She barely has any dialogue and seems a lot more dejected and introspective. I wish she was given more screen time, but almost all of the old cast gets very little focus. It makes sense based on what the story is actually about, but the current lives of the aging cast is something I was very interested in. If I had to guess, I'd say they probably planned for more scenes of Noah and friends, but had to trim them to make the film more concise. Regardless, the role they do play in the film is pretty satisfying as a cap to the story of Patlabor, or at least the involvement of these characters in it. When you take into account the fact that this film's screenplay was written under the impression that it would be the last time the original members of Headgear would work together on Patlabor, this aspect of the film makes a lot more sense, and I can really appreciate what they were doing from that perspective. But to sum things up, though this film doesn't represent everything I love about Patlabor in one package like the first film did, you have to respect it for being a great departure from the norm and pulling off the kind of story it wanted to tell so well. But I guess that's a testament to the people behind it. So that basically sums up everything in the Patlabor series proper, but there are still some lingering entries, starting with the third film, Wasted 13, Patlabor the Movie 3 from 2002. Yeah, so nearly a decade after the second movie, they finally decided to make another Patlabor film. But the reason I don't consider it Patlabor proper is because it takes place in between the first and second movie, and focuses on completely new characters in the Patlabor world. I don't have a problem with stories from different perspectives being told at all, but there's no doubt that this is a spin-off. The film follows two detectives who are trying to get to the bottom of a series of murders, but things quickly go from a noir mystery to a violent horror film about a giant monster. I don't think we've ever seen this amount of gore in Patlabor before, which is another reason this film feels like such an outlier in the franchise. Just like the Griffin arc from the TV series, this story is based on a portion of the manga that was also about a giant monster. In terms of production values, I'd say it's pretty great. Characters can look and move a little weirdly at times, and there's some noticeable CGI in places, but I think it holds up pretty well with the other two films. They put a ton of detail in the places that matter, and the background art is often incredibly well done. The intense realism tends to make the horror elements even scarier, and when a labor does show up, it looks incredibly sharp and on model. Oh, check it out, some Patlabor characters just walked in the room. Wait, where are you going? You can definitely tell this film is trying hard to follow the precedent set by the second film with the way everything is presented. This was all cool in 2, but I don't want everything in the franchise to be this somber and realistic, with such little involvement of Labor's or Division 2's characters in general. At the same time, I get that a detective story like this wouldn't have so many labors in it, and I do enjoy the change of pace, letting us see the world from a different perspective. It just exists in a weird position in the series, since it's the last major release it's gotten, and it's called the third film when it's pretty unrelated to the other two. They should have called it Patlabor Detective Story or something. Regardless, I do think it's a pretty solid film, all things considered. There are some questionable moments in the story, but overall it can be enjoyed if you know what you're getting yourself into. Other than that, there are really only little miscellaneous things left to mention, like this weird advertisement for Axia cassette tapes that was included in the middle of each episode of the original OVA. Then there's this short 4-minute sequence of animations called One Day of Noah, which was released as part of a music compilation. It shows Noah stumble through one of her days off, and it's really charming and down to earth. There's no dialogue, yet it still conveys a lot of personality through Noah's mannerisms. There's also Mini Pato, a series of shorts explaining the Patlabor universe, which were made as a tie-in for the third film. If you want something a little more humorous to go along with that film, then give it a run-through. Surprisingly, it was even given a PSP game for some reason. Let's not forget about that live-action adaptation from 2014 called Patlabor the Next Generation, which got 13 episodes and finished off with a feature film in 2015. It's technically a sequel to the 3 films with a new cast, directed by Mamoru Oshii, so I'll definitely need to give it a fair shake at some point in the future. There's also a short 7-minute reboot from 2016 created for the Japan Animator Expo. It's actually called Mobile Police Patlabor Reboot, and shows what the Patlabor concept would look like in modern day. All the labors are full CGI, but really, when it's just them on screen fighting, it doesn't look bad at all. It's rocking those Guilty Gear graphics pretty well. I like how a lot of the shots emphasize the size of the labors and make it seem like a giant monster battle. I can sense a spark between these new characters, but it isn't quite there, and the main pilot looks kinda generic compared to Noah. I could see myself enjoying this well enough if it was a full anime of this quality, but it isn't. I'm not really sure what the intentions were with this, since they haven't come out with anything based on it. Maybe they were just trying to get people interested in the idea of a new animated Patlabor series. Since then, they have actually announced a new series called Patlabor EZY, which should come out sometime soon. The thing is, we've yet to hear anything about whether it's based on the reboot, the original series, or something completely new. If they go with new main characters, I hope they have a good dynamic between them. I'm fully prepared for all the labors to be CGI, but I can deal with it if they're at least as good looking as in the short. If it can capture the spirit of the original, it should be great, so I'm looking forward to it. The world's been needing a real Patlabor entry for a while now. To sum things up, Patlabor is a series that you can get a ton of enjoyment out of. With all of the OVAs, movies, and episodes of the TV series, it'll keep you entertained for a while. But even after all of that, I still wish there was more. It's a multifaceted series that can in one instance appear as a straight-up comedy, then in another raise the stakes and portray a situation like that with the seriousness and urgency it requires. It never gets hopeless or loses the chance for its characters to act in a heroic manner, and I really enjoy that. I hope this video has helped you get a feel of what each entry is like, so you know how each one will appeal to you. If you're a Mecha fan and haven't checked this series out, then hopefully you're in for a refreshing experience. But I think this series has a universal appeal. You don't need to already love Mecha to enjoy Patlabor, since the robots are just one selling point of the series. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to go find a Laserdisc player because these Patlabor releases look amazing. The names scrolling up the screen right now are my patrons, who I can't thank enough for sticking by my side despite my recent release schedule, or lack thereof. This is also the first time on the channel I've been able to promote that I moved from Twitter to Instagram, so follow me over there if you want to get updates on my life while I'm here in Korea. My Discord server is where I'm always hanging out and discussing things with you guys. Feel free to join it if you want to have an easy way to contact me, or if you want to contribute to a fun community. See you next time, and hopefully the next one won't take so long.